right, let's get into it. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Victor Davis Hanson's The Dying Citizen. And from the excerpts we've got, it's safe to say it's a pretty provocative book, ready to challenge some assumptions.
What strikes me is how Hanson connects all these different things,
Really?
globalization, tribalism, the power of the administrative state, and argues they're all kind of working together to undermine what it means to be an American citizen.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches. And one of the most interesting things he brings up is this idea of new peasantry emerging in America.
It's not like the peasants we imagine from, medieval times or anything, but it's this new class struggling in the 21st century. I mean, think about it. 58% of Americans have less than $1,000 in savings. That's a huge chunk of the population, just one medical emergency away from complete disaster.
It really makes you think, how can you even think about being an active participant in your community when you're constantly worried about just making ends meet? Is that kind of the foundation of Hanson's new peasantry?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. He argues that this new class is weighed down by debt, they lack the traditional assets of the middle class, and they're just incredibly vulnerable to any kind of economic shock. It's a pretty far cry from that historical ideal of a strong, independent middle class that used to be so central to American identity.
And it's happening right in front of us. He uses some really concrete examples, like the insane housing costs in places like Santa Cruz, California. A modest home there can cost almost $1 million.
It just highlights how those traditional markers of middle-class life, owning a home, having some financial stability, they're becoming more and more out of reach for a lot of Americans. Makes you wonder, are we creating the conditions for Hanson's new peasantry ourselves with the gig economy and student loan debt and the housing crisis?
It's a pretty sobering thought. And then on top of all that, Hanson also argues that we're becoming more tribal, moving away from that whole melting pot ideal.
Yeah, he's really worried about the rise of identity politics, where it seems like people are prioritizing group affiliation over a shared sense of national identity. And historically, that kind of tribalism has led to conflict and even the downfall of empires. I mean, think about ancient Greece and Rome. They ultimately were weakened by these internal divisions based on tribal loyalties.
I see what Hanson's saying about the dangers of tribalism, but isn't it also important to celebrate diverse cultures? How do we balance those two things?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Hanson isn't saying diversity is a bad thing. He acknowledges that different cultures bring richness and value. His concern is about the potential dangers of multiculturalism when it's taken to an extreme, when it starts to undermine the idea of equality under the law, and instead we have unequal treatment based on group identity.
He brings up the controversy over California's Proposition 209, which banned affirmative action based on race. It's a really complex issue with no easy answers, but it definitely makes you think about those unintended consequences even when policies are well-intentioned.
Absolutely. And then Hanson throws another log on the fire. This idea of the rise of the unelected, this huge administrative state with all its regulatory power.
He even uses that term deep state, but he makes it clear he's not talking about some conspiracy theory.
Right. When Hanson talks about the deep state, he's talking about a real phenomenon, the power of unelected officials. He argues they're basically taking power away from our elected representatives and by extension from the citizens themselves. I mean, for every new law that Congress passes, unelected bureaucrats create 18 new regulations. It's mind-boggling.
Wow, that statistic about regulations is pretty crazy. It really shows how much power these unelected officials have. Can you think of any recent examples where a regulation felt like the government was overreaching?
Oh, there are tons of examples, like that EPA clean water rule. Remember that one? It expanded the EPA's authority to the point where they could even regulate puddles on private property. It was super controversial, and I think it really speaks to Hanson's larger point about how unelected officials can have a lot of power over everyday people's lives.
It makes you wonder, how do we balance expertise with accountability in a society that's so complex? Where do we draw the line?
It's a tough question for sure. And then there's globalization. Hanson doesn't deny that it's brought some benefits, but he argues that it's come at a cost for a lot of Americans.
He paints a pretty bleak picture.
Yeah.
Do you think he's being too pessimistic? Are there any counter-arguments to what he's saying?
He definitely raises some valid points. I mean, he's really critical of what he calls the globalist elite. He says they often put international interests ahead of the needs of American citizens, and he points to things like the loss of American jobs and the growing gap between the rich and the poor as evidence of globalization's uneven impact. This sense of division isn't just happening within America, though. Hanson argues that globalization plays a role there, too.
Okay, I'm listening. How does globalization tie into this idea of the dying citizen?
Well, he says that As we become more interconnected with the rest of the world, we start to lose sight of what it means to be American. Our unique cultural identity gets kind of diluted in this global melting pot. He even questions how effective international organizations like the UN and NATO really are, suggesting they often don't live up to their promises and can even undermine American sovereignty.
So it's like this perfect storm brewing, right? A
Hmm.
shrinking middle class, rising tribalism, unelected bureaucrats gaining more and more power, and globalization's impact on American workers and even on our culture. That's a lot to process.
It is, but it's not all doom and gloom. Hansen does offer some suggestions for how we can push back against these trends. He believes the antidote is to really focus on the principles that made America unique in the first place: individual liberty, limited government, and a sense of shared identity rooted in our history and values.
So he's basically saying each of us needs to ask ourselves, what can I do to be a better citizen?
Exactly. If we want to preserve American citizenship, we need to be informed, we need to be engaged, and we need to be active participants in our democracy. This deep dive into Hanson's book is really just the beginning of that journey.
So we've talked about some of Hanson's big picture concerns, but it's easy to get lost in the abstract.
Hmm.
How does this idea of the dying citizen actually play out in the real world?
Well, take Hanson's idea of the new peasantry, for example. It's not just some theoretical concept. He really brings it to life by describing how this shift is happening right in his own hometown in California's Central Valley, a place that used to be, a symbol of middle-class prosperity.
What's changed there? I imagine it was pretty different back in the day.
Oh, yeah, totally different. Hanson talks about how it used to be surrounded by orchards and farms providing jobs and that sense of community, that classic agrarian ideal, the independent farmer owning land, supporting a family. It sounds idyllic almost.
But that's not the reality anymore.
Not so much these days. He says a lot of those orchards have been replaced by these huge housing developments and big box stores, and the people living in those houses, they're often struggling just to get by, stuck in low-paying jobs. He even throws out some pretty startling statistics like 80% of the jobs created in California in the last decade paid less than the median income. So even if the economy is booming for some, it's not really reaching everyone.
It's that whole widening gap between the rich and the poor that we hear so much about, but it's hitting home in a very real way for people in Hanson's community.
And it goes beyond just the economics, too. Hansen argues that this shift is also impacting people's sense of citizenship. When you're struggling financially, you often feel like you have less of a stake in your community. You're less likely to vote, less likely to get involved in local politics. It's kind of a vicious cycle.
It's like they disengage because they feel like the system isn't working for them, but then who fills that void? Does that tie into Hanson's worries about tribalism too?
Oh, absolutely. He uses this really powerful analogy to describe what's happening to our sense of shared identity. He says America used to be like a melting pot where different cultures and ethnicities all blended together to create something new and uniquely American.
Yeah, that classic image of all these different ingredients coming together in one delicious stew.
Exactly. But now Hansen says we're more like a salad bowl where, all the ingredients are tossed together, but they still remain separate and distinct.
So we can appreciate the individual parts, but are we losing that sense of a unified whole,
Yeah.
that essence of what it means to be American?
That's exactly what he's worried about. And it's not that we should erase our cultural differences or anything. He recognizes the value of diversity. But he sees this playing out in how we talk about race and ethnicity. We're increasingly focused on what sets us apart rather than emphasizing what we have in common.
It definitely goes back to his point about the dangers of identity politics dividing us instead of uniting us. I know reading that anecdote about the soccer game really got me thinking about that. The crowd was booing the American team because they were cheering for their country of origin instead. It made me wonder, have I ever prioritized my own cultural background over my American identity? It's a tough question to ask yourself.
It is. And Hansen doesn't just rely on anecdotes either. He cites studies that show Americans are becoming more and more polarized along racial and ethnic lines. We're increasingly segregating ourselves into these homogenous communities where we rarely interact with people who are different from us.
It's almost like we're retreating into our own little tribes, afraid of the unknown.
And he argues that this kind of self-segregation can be just as damaging as forced segregation. It creates these echo chambers where our beliefs and prejudices are just constantly reinforced, and we become less tolerant of anyone who holds different views. And of course, social media just throws fuel on the fire. It allows us to curate our news feeds and filter out anything that challenges our worldview.
So we're more tribal, less economically secure, and increasingly distrustful of institutions? It's a lot to process.
Yeah.
And then Hansen brings globalization into the mix.
And he's not just talking about the economic impact, which we already touched on. He's also worried about globalization's cultural impact.
Okay, I'm curious, how does that fit into this whole idea of the dying citizen?
Well, Hanson argues that globalization has eroded our sense of national identity. As we become more interconnected with the rest of the world, we risk losing sight of what it means to be American. He uses the example of language, how English is becoming this global lingua franca, and as a result, other languages are being spoken less and less.
So we risk losing those unique cultural nuances that come with speaking different languages. The humor, the
Yeah.
poetry, the unique ways of seeing the world. It would be a shame to lose all that.
Absolutely. And he argues that this trend is also impacting our sense of history. As we focus more and more on global events, we're losing touch with our own national narrative. We're forgetting the stories and traditions that shaped our national character.
It's like we're trading our birthright for a bowl of lentils, giving up the richness and depth of American citizenship for the fleeting pleasures of consumerism and instant gratification. But isn't there some value in becoming citizens of the world?
That's the question Hansen asks. He's not saying globalization is all bad. He acknowledges the benefits.
But he's urging us to be aware of the potential downsides, to really think critically about how globalization is impacting our sense of citizenship.
Yeah,
What are we losing in this pursuit of global interconnectedness?
exactly. And it's not just about lamenting the dying citizen either. Hansen does offer some suggestions for how we can push back against these trends. He talks about this idea of civic renewal.
Okay, what does that actually look like in practice? Give me something concrete.
Well, it means revitalizing our sense of community, engaging in local politics, participating in those shared rituals that bind us together as Americans. It starts at the local level. Think about supporting local businesses, going to town hall meetings, getting to know your neighbors.
Rebuilding those bonds of community that have frayed in recent years.
Exactly. And Hansen argues that as we strengthen our local communities, we'll naturally start to feel more connected to our nation as a whole.
That whole think globally, act locally idea, it's about being an active citizen, not just a passive observer. But how do we get people to buy into that, especially when they're feeling so disillusioned and disconnected?
Hansen believes education is a key part of the solution. We need to teach young people about American history and civics and the principles that our democracy is based on. It's not about blind patriotism. It's about fostering a thoughtful, informed love of country that's rooted in understanding both our strengths and our weaknesses.
Acknowledging that America, like any nation, has made mistakes, but we've learned from them and strive to be better.
Exactly. He also talks about the importance of national service, whether it's military service or community service, as a way to foster a sense of shared purpose and national unity.
Mm.
It's about giving back to our country and recognizing that we're all part of something larger than ourselves.
It seems like Hanson's argument goes beyond just, politics or policy. It's almost like he's talking about the soul of America.
I think that's a good way to put it. He's saying citizenship isn't just about having a legal status. It's about this shared set of values and beliefs and responsibilities that bind us together as a nation.
Yeah, that sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves. Being part of a story that's been unfolding for centuries.
And he's worried we're losing that connection, that we're becoming these atomized individuals adrift in a sea of globalized indifference. Like you said, trading our birthright for a bowl of lentils.
But it's tempting to dismiss all this as just nostalgia for some mythical golden age.
Yeah.
What are the real dangers that Hanson sees in losing our sense of citizenship?
Well, he argues that a decline in citizenship leads to a decline in what he calls civic virtue. When people feel disconnected from their community and their country, they just care less about the common good.
They're less likely to volunteer or donate to charity or even vote. They just kind of retreat into their own little worlds.
Exactly. And that creates a breeding ground for corruption and tyranny. When citizens are passive and disengaged, it's much easier for those in power to abuse their authority.
It's like that old saying, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. But Hanson's saying we're becoming less vigilant, less willing to stand up for the principles that our democracy is built on.
He is. But he also believes there's hope. He says we can reverse these trends, but it requires a conscious effort, a willingness to rediscover and reaffirm the values that have made America what it is.
Okay, but where do we even begin? How do we rebuild that sense of citizenship when it feels like everything is pulling us apart?
Hansen talks about the importance of remembering our history, understanding the sacrifices that were made to secure our freedoms. It's about honoring those who came before us and carrying that torch of liberty forward.
Not just blindly celebrating the past, but learning from it.
Exactly. And it's also about engaging in civil discourse. You know, having those tough conversations with people who hold different views, it's about really listening, trying to understand different perspectives and finding that common ground.
I know it's easier said than done in our current climate, but it's so important.
It really is. He also emphasizes personal responsibility. Each of us has a duty to be informed, to be engaged, and to contribute to the well-being of our community and our country.
It's about taking ownership of our citizenship, not just passively enjoying the benefits.
Right. And finally, Hanson talks about the importance of hope. He believes that even with all the challenges we face, America still has the potential to be that shining beacon of freedom and opportunity for the world.
It's that belief in the American dream. The idea that anyone can achieve success through hard work and determination.
A dream that's definitely worth fighting for, worth preserving for future generations.
So Hanson's book is really a wake-up call, a challenge for each of us to examine our own role as citizens. What can we do to strengthen the fabric of our nation? What kind of legacy are we leaving for the generations that come after us?
He reminds us that citizenship isn't a spectator sport. It's an active, ongoing commitment to the principles that make America unique, a commitment that feels more important now than ever. This deep dive into the dying citizen has been quite a journey. He doesn't offer any easy answers, but he leaves us with a lot to think about.
He does. It's a book that sparks a lot of questions that we all need to wrestle with if we want to create a better future for ourselves and for generations to come. What resonated most with you from The Dying Citizen? What will you carry forward from this conversation? That's something for each of us to ponder.
Loved this video? Smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss out on future content. And don't forget to order the book, link below.